Good morning. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you all for coming to this discussion on the Christian right in the Trump and post-Trump eras. My name is Dan Cox. I'm a research fellow here at AEI studying public opinion, politics, and religion. This is the first of hopefully many collaborations with American universities centered on congressional and presidential studies. Before we begin, I'd like to offer some thanks to the dining and event staff here at AEI for all their work in setting this up, and for Morning Consult for conducting a new survey exclusively for this event. The topic we're discussing today is not new. It's received a lot of attention in the popular and religious press. It has stumped a lot of really smart folks as well. The relationship between Trump and the conservative Christian movement defies easy explanation. From the earliest days of Trump's campaign, an open question was how would Trump, a thrice-married admitted adulterer, fare among social conservatives? Well, he's actually fared fairly well. He exceeded expectations in the GOP primary, and particularly in places like South Carolina with a heavily conservative Christian electorate. And in the general election, he won 81% of conservative Christian voters. And speculation of a lackluster turnout among evangelicals didn't pan out either. Evangelical turnout in 2016 mirrored that of 2012 when Mitt Romney ran. Even amidst the relentless series of scandals and controversies plaguing the Trump administration, evangelical support has been a consistent bright spot. It's a reason that a primary challenge against Trump would probably fail if it ever even materializes, and why he would remain a viable contender for 2020, despite lackluster approval numbers. Looking ahead, it seems unlikely at this point that conservative Christians will defect en masse. Jerry Falwell, head of Liberty University, recently said that there's nothing that Trump could do that would lose evangelical support. Well, why is that? There's a number of explanations that have been offered, which we are going to probe. Panic over the precipitous decline of Christianity in the US, the inability of past Republican leaders to effectively push back against cultural change in the US on things like same-sex marriage, and a laser-like focus on nominating conservative judges. These are some of the theories that we're going to look at today and maybe offer a few of our own. But we're also going to try to understand how the nature of conservative Christian politics might be changing and where the movement goes from here. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to gauge these questions with an absolutely stellar panel, who I will introduce now. To my immediate left is Joanna Piacenza, a features editor for Morning Consult. Joanna's work has been cited in the New York Times, BBC, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post, among other outlets. Before her role at Morning Consult, she worked as the editor for Public Religion Research Institute. Next, David Barker is a professor of government and director of the Center on Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University. He has published 3 books and over 80 publications. His latest one, One Nation, Two Realities, Dueling Facts and American Democracy, was just released. Next, Emily Ekins is a fellow and director of polling at Cato Institute, where she designs, conducts national surveys, and leads Cato Institute's project on public opinion. She is the author of several public opinion studies, including The 5 Types of Trump Voters and the State of Free Speech and Tolerance in America. And lastly, not leastly, Emma Green. Emma is a staff writer for The Atlantic, where she covers politics, policy, and religion. In 2018, she was the winner of the Religion News Association's First Place Award in Religion News Analysis. Her work has appeared in outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and National Public Radio. Joanna will kick things off with a presentation of the new Morning Consult poll. Next, David will present some of his own research. And then Emily and Emma will offer their thoughts as well. After each of the panelists have made remarks, I will pose a couple of questions to the panel, and we'll take a few questions from the audience as well. And I encourage the panel to ask questions of each other as well. So with that, Joanna, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. So thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here. When Dan first approached me about doing a survey, I got very excited. This is a topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts. So the point of this survey was, in a lot of our research and reporting, we've kind of picked up on social anxiety, cultural anxiety that a lot of conservative Christians are facing in the last couple decades. And we wanted to see kind of where that stood now that we're 2 years into Trump, and what that means for 2020 and moving forward. So that's a little bit what this presentation will be. Here's some stats about the survey methodology. We try to be pretty transparent at Morning Consult. You can go see all of the crosstabs posted at morningconsult.com for the survey I'm about to go over. if you want to see where different groups stand on a variety of issues. So of course, of this many-slided presentation, there's only one number wrong, and it is the very first one. So that number should be 64. I apologize for that. This first one is gauging whether people think that American culture has changed a great deal in the last 10 years. As you can see, conservative Christians, the topic of this panel, are not alone. Majorities of all Americans, regardless of party ID, regardless of religious tradition, believe that the country has changed a great deal. Now, has it changed for the better or for the worse? Again, conservative Christians are not alone in this. Majorities of Republicans, majorities of Democrats feel as though that the country has changed mostly for the worst. Now, what's interesting about this is that this was taken in April, last month. If this would have been asked in, say, October 2016, right before the election, I feel as though the share of Democrats that say things have changed for the worse would be a little bit different. One of the things that we could be picking up on here under conservative Christians, such as white evangelical Protestants and Republicans, are these people feeding into kind of the tagline of the Trump administration, of the president himself, "Make America Great Again." The idea that things have gotten worse, we need to make it better. Another interesting finding from this survey was white evangelicals feel as though they're losing social and political influence in this country today. This is kind of one of the biggest telltale signs, I feel as though, for white evangelical Protestant support of Trump. They're about twice as likely to say that they will have less influence in the next 10 years than they are to say that they will have more influence. Democrats, as you can see, are a little bit more optimistic about the next decade. 35% say that they will have more influence, while only 24% say that they will have less. This also kind of feeds into the idea, to a feeling that many white evangelicals and many conservative Christians might be feeling. They feel like they're losing power and influence. They feel like they're being discriminated against. Now, this is also a very interesting question. I know Dan has done some research on this. A few years ago, PRI found that Republicans feel as though Christians are being more discriminated against than Muslims, and I believe immigrants and other kind of racial and ethnic minority groups as well. So right at the top, roughly 4 in 10 white evangelical Protestants say that evangelical Christians experience a lot of discrimination in the country today. Compare that to 18% of all adults that said the same. Now, this was another interesting element of the survey. We put this on here, and included this on the slide, to show that white evangelicals and Republicans are actually very, very similar in their policy positions, in their goals. What do they want out of the administration? What do they want Trump to do? What do they want Congress to do? They're color-coded in a way that among Republicans is descending down in color, and then you can see that it's roughly about the same. Their top priority and their second priority are nearly identical. And this is important because if you look at the next slide, this is who white evangelical Protestants and Republicans would prefer to be at the top of the ticket in 2020. 16-point difference between Republicans and white evangelical Protestants who want Trump. Light blue is Trump, in case you can't see it. Dark blue is Pence. The other light blue, kind of the sliver, is anyone else, any other Republican. And the don't know, no opinion is the gray. So here you can see kind of the double-digit difference between these two groups. It's important to note, however, that in 2016, white evangelicals voted for Trump at an 8-2 margin, 80-20 about. So that 20% is about in line as what we saw 2-3 years ago during the election. That also means that 20% is up for grabs, that 8% could be up for grabs. One of the things that we talked about when we were writing this question, when you came to me about this survey, is whether or not we'd see a larger share going to Pence, because Pence, for many white evangelicals, might be a figure that represents their values a bit more than Trump. I was a little bit surprised to see that 18 number not be higher. Because the 13 and 18 is about within margin of error between the two groups. This is that same data, but broken out so you can see white mainline Protestants, white Catholics, and the religiously unaffiliated. So where they stand on who they would prefer to be at the top of the ticket for Republicans in 2020. This, to me, is revealing because it shows that white Catholics and white mainlines are much more up for grabs in terms of Democrats getting their vote than white evangelical Protestants are, based on the feeling that they're losing power and influence, based on the feeling that they're being discriminated against, all these kind of feelings that are driving the vote. Those are still remaining among white evangelical Protestants. But white mainlines and white Catholics, they're a little bit more divided in terms of who they would vote for Republican. And this is an interesting question that I wanted to put in here, mostly because I want to dive a little bit deeper into it. And I know that probably Dan is going to as well. We asked people whether they agree or disagree with a very interesting question, which is a trend question I found out. Human nature is fundamentally perverse and corrupt. Really happy questions in polling. Sometimes we get to ask happy things. Sometimes we get to ask things like this. You'll see that nearly half of adults agree with that statement. I'm not sure if people want to talk afterwards. We can do a little therapy. But 63% of white evangelical Protestants agreed with that as well. So that's just something to kind of sit with a little bit. And I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that in the panel and your all thoughts afterwards. But I believe that is it. And we go on to the next one.
I think that's me. All right. Hi, everybody. So when political scientists talk about religious influence over political choices, they tend to apply a very convenient and alliterative believing, belonging, and behaving framework, sort of distinguishing between identity, doctrinal beliefs, and church attendance or devotionalism. And so I'm going to walk through some of the ways that each of those things may influence support for Trump, as well as a couple of others, and then apply some data to those questions. And we start, actually, right where Joanna left off. And so, a lot of people, view it as this crazy paradox that evangelicals would support Trump, but really there are a couple of aspects to evangelical Christian doctrine that make it very, very easy to understand, right? And the first one is what Joanna was just talking about, is highly central to Christian, well, especially evangelical Christian doctrine, this notion of human depravity, right? It goes all the way back to the Calvinists from several hundred years ago, but it almost defines evangelical Christian belief because evangelicalism, by definition, starts from this assumption that everyone is going to hell unless you, right, are saved by Jesus, right? And so if everyone is going to hell, well, why the heck would everybody be going to hell? Because because of original sin, because of human depravity, because human beings are at root selfish and wicked, and they need Jesus to save them from what is otherwise going to be, a pretty bad eternity. And so if you start from that assumption, right, then you don't have very high expectations for anybody, right? And the fact that Trump, right, is a philanderer and a liar and all these other things, not very nice on Twitter, et cetera, should not come as any surprise. And they're like willing to accept that and relate to that. Now you might say, well, okay, whoops. Uh-oh. What happened here? Let's see. Maybe if we do this. Oh, okay, I'm going to click really quickly.
One more time.
Through all
the data you missed.
Okay, so if you start from that assumption, right, then you're willing to sort of look past some of Trump's foibles. And you might say, well, they weren't willing to look past Bill Clinton's foibles in the 1990s, and there's some hypocrisy there. And yes, there's some hypocrisy there, but there's a lot of hypocrisy to go around when it comes to Bill Clinton, right? And it also is worth pointing out that actually a decent number of evangelicals did support Bill Clinton relative to what we see today, right? I mean, more evangelicals voted for Bill Clinton in 92 and 96 than had voted for Dukakis, than had voted for Mondale, and than had voted for any Democrat since. And so, the next thing, actually, even before we get to that, something else on human depravity. is that if you start, again, from this assumption that human nature is fundamentally wicked, then it actually predicts certain other types of political attitudes. And I've done a fair amount of work on this that I could point you to if you're interested. But it shows that like that belief, right, believing that human nature is fundamentally either selfish or evil versus good, predicts a host of conservative political attitudes. And we could talk more about why that is if you're interested. The second thing, though, that relates to, again, basic doctrine or belief systems as to why evangelicals might support Trump is this notion of make America great again, right? So while it is certainly true, right, people have pointed out that that phrase is a nativist dog whistle, right? And it is. It is a nativist dog whistle. But it's also a dog whistle, or maybe not even a dog whistle, maybe just sort of like a straight out statement to evangelical Christians that, hey, the United States has always been great, was great. The reason it's great is because of its connection to God. And central, again, to evangelical doctrine is this notion, right, of the shining city on the hill, going back to John Winthrop in the 1700s or 1600s, and that the United States is special, right? The United States is exceptional. And that the reason the United States is special or exceptional is because it's basically struck a deal with God, right? And that if you listen to evangelical sermons, you'll hear this, right, consistently. That the second that America turns its back on that relationship with God is the second that it is going to cease to be great. And so this phrase of make America great again, while you can apply it to different sorts of racial and ethnic and xenophobic types of attitudes, it also speaks to evangelical Christians in this sense that, again, the cultures are getting away from them, the country is secularizing, the country is turning away from God, and we need to turn back. Okay, the second piece of this is belonging, right, as I said. So there is a lot of this that just has to do with identity, right? And Joanna referred to some of this as well, right? And that if you identify as an evangelical Christian or as a born-again Christian, some of that reflects your beliefs, but some of it is just a cultural identifier, right? Certainly in certain parts of the country, like the South, right? And so it is the case, and Joanna's data pointed this out as well, that Republicans in general, and certainly quote-unquote red American conservatives in certain parts of the country, do have a sense that the elite culture on the coast is abandoning them, has abandoned them, looks down on them, right? And so they feel threatened, right? They feel attacked. They do feel discriminated against and persecuted. And so Trump's appeal, again, is not just to white guys, right, who are threatened by the growth in immigration or threatened by the Me Too movement. It also speaks to these evangelicals who feel like we used to sort of like have a place in American society, and we don't feel like we have that place anymore. When we turn on the TV, we can't watch the Academy Awards without having somebody look down at us or make fun of us, right? So that is part of this as well. And after all, perceived persecution has been central to evangelical doctrine forever, right? Going all the way back to Paul. And if you grew up in an evangelical church, you heard this routinely about how you should take pleasure in being persecuted for your faith, and you can expect to be persecuted for your faith. And so all of this is very biblical in their view. All right, finally, well, not finally, but the role of Christian religiosity. Some of the work by Emily shows that this actually maybe cuts against. And so here what we're talking about is church attendance and private devotionalism, whether it be prayer, scripture reading, whatever. And the idea here is that aside from identity and aside from what you may believe, some people are just more religious than others, right? And so people who are more religious than others are going to, that's going to affect their attitudes as well. And there are two main ways that can happen. One might be, hey, you go to church more because you're more committed. You're a more serious Christian. You care more about this stuff. You think more about this stuff. And that might change your attitudes on certain things. Another aspect, though, is you might go to church and then that's a social network, right? And so then social network effects kick in where everybody you know and talk to in the Sunday school group and in the Wednesday night Bible study and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they all seem to support Trump. They don't seem to have a problem with Trump, so I guess I don't either. Okay. Two other things, quickly. So other people have pointed out, rightly, that another thing that is consistent about Trump supporters and evangelicals is just that they tend to, there are basic personality differences, frankly. And so most social scientists refer to something called authoritarianism, the authoritarian personality, which has a little bit of a pejorative spin to it, right? But it doesn't have to, right? Work by Jonathan Haidt and others has reframed this and just talked about the basic moral foundation of having like respect for authority or an orientation toward deferring to authority. That's fundamental to Christian and religious culture as well. And empirically, we do just see this, right? We see that evangelical Christians do tend to score much more highly in authoritarianism than do non-evangelicals. And one of the aspects of that is craving or desiring strong leadership. Or at least pronouncements of strong leadership, which they get in Trump. And then finally, we get the bargaining explanation, right? And Dan referred to this earlier, which is simply, hey, they may not like the guy, but the guy is delivering, right? And they thought about this in 2016. Hey, the Supreme Court is up for grabs. Abortion is important to us. A lot of other things are important to us. And this guy seems to get it. This guy seems to stand for us. And this guy claims that he's going to deliver the policy goods, and he has, right? Trump has delivered the policy goods, not just on the Supreme Court, but across the board over the course of the past 2 years, to a degree that previous Republican presidents have not, including George W. Bush, who was, after all, one of their own. Okay, so I want to quickly go through some data here. This is data from the voter study group the Democracy Fund houses. Emily is part of that group, and she works with these data as well. And what I want to do is basically test these different so-called explanations or hypotheses and compare Trump support among different levels of believers, belongers, behaviors, authoritarians, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just quickly do that. So first, we see the overall mean level of support on a scale from 0 to 1, where 1 means you love Trump and 0 means you hate Trump, among Republicans, okay? This is just Republicans, just Republican voters. The overall mean level of support is 0.71. Now, what about among secular Republicans? That surprises you, doesn't it? Basically the same. That's within the margin of error. So essentially the same as the overall mean. Now, what about inactive evangelical Christians? Right? So these are people who identify as born again and believe that the Bible is inerrant, but don't go to church on a regular basis. 81, right? Now, what about active evangelical Christians, right? So the same people, but people who are actually going to church all the time. Drops back down, right? So again, actually being religious actually leads you to support Trump less among this group, right? The highest level of support we see among religious people are people who identify as born-again Christians, but aren't actually like doing anything about that most of the time. Inactive mainline or Catholics, 56, right? So again, among Republicans, people who identify as either mainline Protestants, any of those denominations, or as Catholics, but don't go to church, that's your lowest level of support. Actually, it's the same. It's whether you're active or not, right? Mainline Protestants and white Catholics tend to support Trump within the GOP less than anybody else. Okay, so now this distinction between authoritarians and non-authoritarians, right? And we could talk about how I measured that. There's not time to go into it right now, just if you will, trust me, okay? So among non-authoritarian or libertarian types of Republicans, you might say, support for Trump is 6.62, but among authoritarian Republicans, it's 0.79, right? So that lends a certain degree of credence to this idea that Trump is attractive because he seems like a strong leader. Now, what about pro-choice Republicans? There are some, right? And so pro-choice Republicans, this is where I'm just going to preview it. We're going to see a big jump here. So pro-choice Republicans only support Trump at 0.55, pro-life Republicans at 0.85. So this leads credence to that notion of bargaining, right? That it really is this like, okay, whatever, we may not love this guy, but we want what he's going to deliver to us. And then finally, I just wanted to, just for comparison purposes, so there's not necessarily a relationship between sexism and Republican identity, but I just wanted to show that the difference and how much of an effect that actually does make, right? So your attitudes towards gender roles within the Republican Party. So Republicans who have modern ideas, let's call them that, toward gender roles tend to support Trump at 0.46, whereas people who have traditional ideas with respect to gender roles, 1.0. Perfect correlation. So that's it. I went over my time, and I'll pass the baton here. So.
Yeah, whatever, if you have any thoughts.
So I'm just providing some remarks on some of the excellent presentations that we've had a chance to see today, as well as comment a little bit on some of my own research on religious voters, and in particular, religious Trump voters. So the first thing I will just re-emphasize what's already been said, that Trump drew disproportionate support from those Republicans who don't go to church very often, which is really interesting. I think a lot of people think, well, don't all Republicans go to church? Isn't that like what Republicans are? Well, no, actually about half of Republicans say they never or very rarely ever attend religious services. Now, most of them will tell you that their religious identity is important to them, but that doesn't mean they actually behave in a manner that would provide evidence that they are religious in going to church. And so he drew disproportionately from people who say that being Christian is very important to them, but not necessarily going to church. In fact, the people who said they went to church the most were the ones that supported Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and other candidates in the early GOP primary. So one way I think about this is that Trump drew disproportionately from voters who draw their identity from their religious reference group, but he drew less support from voters who draw religious guidance or instruction from their religious reference group. So I think that that's really important. And in 2016, right after the election, if you looked at Trump voters by how often they attended religious services, the people who attended church the most frequently they were the least likely to have very warm feelings towards President Trump. It was only 49% had very favorable feelings of Trump, compared to about 2/3 of Trump voters who never attend religious services or only rarely attend religious services. So I think that that's notable, and I think that the Hollywood Access tapes probably had a lot to do with that, just because the survey was taken right after that. But they still voted for him, right? These are Trump voters. And so the questions are, why did these evangelical, or not just evangelical, but just religious Trump voters who attend church regularly vote for him when he doesn't seem like the most compatible candidate, right? He says that he doesn't really think he needs to repent for his actions. And when he talked about 2 Corinthians, I thought that was funny.
The best.
Anyone who's very religious would know that you say 2 Corinthians, and it just is just a little bit of a cultural cue there. It just shows that there's kind of a lack of awareness or knowledge about that. So what happened? And then also, since 2016, if you look at the Democracy Fund voter study group data over time, 2016, 17, 18, 19, these religious Trump voters, the people that attend weekly, their attitudes have gone straight up for Trump. So what's going on? And so we've had, I think, a lot of data to bear on this question, and this our conversation will further illuminate it. But I think there's a couple of things I'd like to add to this conversation. First is that group-based politics is often about which party is looking out for you. It's not necessarily about which political leader best embodies your particular set of values. It's which party is looking out for you. And I think that Trump communicated that to them, right? Ronald Reagan was also personally not the most religious person, divorced, and just not the most religious person, but he spoke to religious people and said, you have moral authority, your beliefs matter, and I'm going to defend that in the arena of politics. I think Trump did something similar, and I think that they heard that loud and clear. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you look at Trump's core set of supporters, again, these are the people who don't attend church very frequently. The set of issues that are most predictive of their support for Trump were immigration issues. But the religious Trump voters, the Trump voters that attend church services regularly, immigration is not their top issue. We actually saw that in the data, right? It was medical costs, healthcare costs came first. So it's not immigration. So they're different issues. And so I think it goes back to who's looking out for us? And I think they think Trump is looking out for them. And a couple of things to one of the slides that Joanna showed us was that they feel like they are losing social and political influence in society at large. But I feel like they think they're gaining it with Trump because they feel like Trump is defending their moral authority in society. A couple of things. Why might they feel that way? Well, if you think about these high-profile cases of florists, bakers, photographers who have been asked to provide services for same-sex weddings and they've declined for religious reasons and then they're sued, these high-profile cases, the way religious people often view this is they say, look, I don't want to deny services to people. I will provide flowers to anyone, but I don't want to participate in the religious ceremony of a same-sex wedding because they think that violates their religious beliefs. Some people hear those two things and they say that's the same thing, but it's not from the perspective of many, many people. So we've actually polled this, and a majority of Americans say that businesses should be required by law to serve everyone regardless of their background. And even if your religious belief says you're not supposed to, you should still be required to do so. But majorities of Americans say you shouldn't have to provide services for specific activities, like to participate, to actually attend the wedding and provide the pictures and the photography and things like that. So again, some people don't make a distinction, but many people do, and many Christian conservatives feel like they're under attack. And they feel like people like Trump and Republican leadership like Trump would protect them from that kind of attack, if you will. That's how they are perceiving it. And the other thing is also kind of the culture when you think about media, journalism, academia, the HR departments and corporations. The idea Christianity is something that does not have kind of the foothold and prominence that it once had. So an example I'll give is in the TV show Silicon Valley. So it's a TV show about a tech startup in Silicon Valley, and there's this really funny episode where one of the startup guys is a Christian, but it has to be a secret. Oh, he's also gay too, and so he's in the closet for being Christian, but not for being gay. And so the joke is in Silicon Valley you can be anything you want to be, but you can't be Christian. And so that's just a joke. But I think that a lot of Christian conservatives take that quite seriously, and they do feel like Christian conservatives are fired from their jobs for beliefs that they believe are compatible with Christianity, and that businesses are boycotted for these beliefs. And so they do feel like they're under attack. And then the last point about discrimination, Joanna showed a slide in which evangelical Christians thought that they were more discriminated against than other groups. And many people find this quite interesting. I think one of the reasons they feel this way is that it has become socially acceptable to make fun of Christians in social settings, in TV shows, in movies, in media, but it's not socially acceptable to make fun of other religious groups. And so they see a double standard, and so that's why they feel like they're discriminated. Now, the opposing view would say, well, there is all this implicit discrimination that happens every day against these other groups. Well, they're not seeing that. They're seeing the explicit mockery. So look at Broadway. There is a play that is dedicated to just making fun of Mormons. The whole play, right? It's called The Book of Mormon. Now, what's funny is that the Mormon Church decided to advertise in the playbills for that play instead of boycott it, which is quite clever.
You can't fight them.
But you can see where, if you're viewing it from that way, what explicit kind of discrimination, if you will, it is socially acceptable. And I think that they're picking up on that. And then the last thing I'll say here is that partisanship at the end of the day is very strong. And that political science studies have experimentally tested what happens when you tell Democrats or tell Republicans that leadership in their party is supporting a policy that's basically the other side's policy, like, say, welfare. describing a welfare policy that's stringent or generous. You can get people to switch sides and to support policies that are totally antithetical to what typically Democrats support or what typically Republicans support, simply by telling them that Republican leadership or Democratic leadership supports the policy. So that partisan tribalism runs deep, and I think that that's also affecting what we've been seeing in the data.
Thanks.
So I'll offer just a few brief comments to round us out, and then we can move to the question and discussion section. But I'm coming to this conversation as a reporter, and one of the best things about my job is that I get to go out into different communities and ask people questions, try to take the temperature of different segments of this big world that we call evangelicalism. And when it comes down to it, this is actually quite a broad framing. Conservative Christian or evangelical is quite a broad framing because there are many mini universes that are embodied in that label. So I want to tell 3 stories about conversations that I've had from different corners of what you might call the evangelical universe, and the way that, to me, they embody some of the different storylines about this era of politics, and specifically conservative religious voters and Trump. So the first is about a woman who I was fortunate to be able to profile, which came out in October. You should all read it in the October edition of The Atlantic. A woman named Beth Moore, who is arguably the most prominent female Bible teacher in the United States. She's Southern Baptist by upbringing. She does not claim to be a pastor, in part because of the religious teaching of the Southern Baptist denomination. But she has created a ministry where she writes Bible studies and makes videos and goes on television and is ubiquitous in churches across the country, not just in Southern Baptist churches, but in Methodist churches, non-denominational churches across the board for women's Bible studies. And what was so interesting about her, I started following her in the fall of 2016 very closely because she, in a way that contrasted with how she'd behaved before, decided that she had to speak out specifically about politics and specifically about Trump. This was right after the Access Hollywood video. And she tweeted and said basically not that she had a problem with Trump, but that she was really disappointed with male leaders in her world, her religious world, who made excuses for Trump and did not try to condemn this behavior that was seen on the Access Hollywood tape, because she felt that it was a betrayal of everything she believed in, and she felt like, you know, the men were hanging the women out to dry. And over time, she has become more and more vocal. Over the past 2 years or so, she has tweeted and blogged and started to become more and more vocal. Again, not in an explicitly partisan way, although that implication is sometimes there, but really talking about her world and her subculture and how she feels left behind by the earnest and huge embrace of Trump. She feels that it doesn't align with the Christian teachings that she spent her life trying to share with other women. So that sense of displacement from someone who is a lifelong Southern Baptist, is fairly conservative in terms of her beliefs and the world that she occupies, and also who isn't super publicly political. She's not someone who was a political actor before, but feeling this really strong sense of homelessness. That is an important story about evangelicalism, because there may be some evangelicals who voted for Trump but didn't like it, or who didn't vote for Trump and didn't feel like they could, or who have been non-political in the wake of Trump because they feel displaced. This sense of fracture, I think, is there and present even beneath all of these numbers of conglomerates that we see. So that's one. The second conversation that I had was a recent email exchange with a very high-level abortion communication strategist who works with different groups that advocate against abortion, pro-life side. And I talk as a regular part of my job with people who work on this issue. And this particular conversation struck me because this was a woman who's very, very conservative, very religious, and she basically said, when Trump was first running for office, and when we were talking about who was going to be the Republican nominee, I wasn't sure that Trump meant it, that he could be trustworthy on abortion, that he was someone who would be on our side and defend our politics and our team. And so I was wary, and I joined the Trump side, but I wasn't really sure that he would live up. And she said that over the past 2 years, Trump, to her, has demonstrated his total commitment to supporting their cause. Whether or not it's personal doesn't really matter that much to her, because she thinks from a policy perspective, the Trump administration has been extremely strong on this issue where she's coming from the pro-life side. I think that's really important because it's hard to underestimate for a certain segment of religious voters the importance of this issue and seeing it as the foremost policy issue in America. That's not every Republican or every evangelical, but I do think it's a huge determiner, especially in the very politically active segment of a conservative Christian world. Abortion is huge, and the fact that top abortion activists are reflecting a viewpoint that I think is shared among people who are at the grassroots level, that Trump has been on their team for this thing that they care about so much, really is a strong predictor of how they're going to be following along into 2020. The final story I want to share with you is about a recent visit I got to make to Patrick Henry College, which was so fun for me as a reporter. For those of you who aren't familiar, Patrick Henry is a small Christian college that's in Virginia, about an hour outside of DC. It was started, I believe, in the early 2000s or maybe the late 90s, and has a pretty small population of students who focus on legal work. They are known for their debate teams and their sort of mock trial teams, and they have a lot of students who go to law school who then filter up into what you might call the Christian legal movement in DC. And that conversation that I was able to have with students there was fascinating because these were students who deliberately selected a college that is affiliated with evangelical politics, that has an evangelical identity, and that has a core curriculum that's focused on what they call a classical education, reading great books, thinking about sort of the core ideas of the founding of the Republic. And these students communicated to me that they were all in for conservatism. They really care about thinking and engaging on these issues and questions of liberty and freedom and what that means in our politics today, pretty politically savvy. And they didn't really like Trump that much. And I thought that was pretty remarkable, in part because I think it shows that when we're thinking about this era of politics, it's too narrow to imagine it as just Trump, that what's happening in our politics today is just about Trump. He has a way of sucking the oxygen out of every other conversation about politics, and I know that well as a reporter. But I think it would be folly for us to not pay attention to conservative movements and changes that are happening beneath Trump, the kind of infrastructure that has been set up and has been able to be really successful in Washington, in part facilitated by Trump. And to think about the lasting effects of those movements, especially with young people who are growing into these leadership positions in the next 10 or 20 years. I think they'll be shaped by Trumpism and the Trump era of politics, but I don't necessarily think they will be little mini Trumps. And so I think we've got to have some nuance and disentangle how we're thinking about sort of the determined outcomes of this era of our politics. So those are my three stories, and hopefully that will offer some food for thought for you all.
Well, thank you all. There's a lot to chew on here, and I have a whole list of questions, of which I'm only allowed to ask 3.
Good luck.
So the audience actually gets a chance to participate. But one of the things I was really interested in asking you all about is thinking about Trump's appeal and how much of it comes from past administrations. David, you mentioned you referenced this a little bit, that after the 2012 election, there was a lot of criticism of Romney. There was a whole report that went out saying that the GOP needed to moderate their views, or at least position on immigration. But there were also criticisms of Romney himself as being too much of a nice guy. And this idea that are evangelical Christians too nice to win in this current political environment? And you have people like Jerry Falwell Jr. tweeting that conservatives and Christians need to stop electing nice guys. You have Robert Jeffress, a Southern Baptist pastor, saying, Trump may be an SOB, but he's our SOB. And so this feel that in this current political context, you really need a street fighter. And so how much of Trump's appeal is about his ability or his sort of exuding that kind of toughness?
I mean, I'll start if you want. So, I mean, this speaks a little bit to what the data we're showing on the authoritarianism stuff, and so we can expand that beyond the strict definition of authoritarianism. But the notion of being a fighter or being strong is something that has for a long time, right, been central and attractive to the traditionalistic Christian community, right? There's a long history of needing to fight, right, for your beliefs. If you go into some certainly Southern Baptist churches, you will see Bibles that actually have a sword on them, right? So the militaristic or pugilistic or fighting types of imagery and language is actually pervasive within traditionalistic Christian culture, and it translates into support for foreign wars. It translates into tougher stances when it comes to criminal justice policy, and it translates in general to this idea that the role of authority should be more one of encouraging discipline, right, and punishing wrongdoers, right? And so some of the stuff that I'm saying isn't perfectly related to what Dan is asking, but I think it's all related. And the fact that Trump is this guy who stands up and doesn't back down, right? He never apologizes. He doesn't seem, cowardly. He is willing to just like step out there and say stuff, right, that Mitt Romney was not willing to say, that John McCain wasn't willing to say. My guess is that John McCain's support among evangelicals went down the moment that he famously in that town hall defended Barack Obama against the woman who claimed that he was a Muslim. My guess is that a lot of evangelicals saw that and were repulsed, right? And so Donald Trump would never do that, right? He's going to stick with us. He's going to fight for us. And this is, again, in keeping with some of what Emily was saying, and it totally makes sense to me.
That his mentality of, saying it how it is incredibly appealing to a lot of conservative Christians. I'm thinking specifically what you were mentioning, Emily, about you can't make fun of Christians. Right. Or, sorry, you can make fun of Christians, you can't make fun of anyone else. Christians are safe to make fun of, other people aren't. And I'm in this mindset. I just finished a project on what it means to be politically correct. And those who think that there's too much political correctness in this country are disproportionately white, disproportionately male, disproportionately white and male, and disproportionately Trump supporters, very, very strong Trump supporters. And so there could be this feeling that, oh, I can't say this about this group. Oh, I can't say this about these people anymore. Oh, I can't say this, but oh, wait, Christians are being made fun of? Trump supporters are being made fun of? And Trump is one of those people that just doesn't follow those rules. Says whatever he wants.
I would just add that I think the environment that we're in politically is a factor here. Either Trump is a reflection of those politics or he's picking up on it and sort of translating it. We did some work with the Public Religion Research Institute looking at generalized political attitudes across partisan lines, and one of the areas that I was most interested in was how people perceive those who are not like them, so those who are on the opposite side of the political spectrum or opposite in terms of race or religion or whatever. And the figure that stuck out to me so much was the growth from a benchmark study that was found in the 1960s around people being willing to let their child marry someone from the opposite political party. And let me tell you, the numbers were low. I think this is really telling, because what could be more intimate in terms of how you're evaluating another person than I want my child or would be okay with my child marrying someone who's different than I am. And I think that is one of these data points that opens up this broader universe of understanding that right now we're in a political time when people are unable to look across the political spectrum at someone who is unlike them and see someone who is human or someone who is part of a shared political project or community. There's a lot of bloody team sportsmanship, wanting to take down the other side, believing the other side is evil or out to get you. And it may be that either side, when they reflect that viewpoint, is picking up on stuff that's real. But I think that Trump has both picked up on that and very successfully utilized that part of our politics, but also very much hardened it. And I think that will be one of the lasting legacies of the Trump era, is the ways in which he has contributed to the hardening of these attitudes about people who are different than us politically.
On both sides. And just one more thing about this. This tribalism, this sort of like extreme dislike or fear or hate of the other side, it's enhanced when you feel like your side is a discriminated against minority or is losing. And a lot of people, secularists tend to not understand how in the world Christians could feel like a discriminated against minority. Like, you guys have the majority of the population. You've always had the majority of the population. To a certain extent, our calendar and our lives are revolve around your holidays and all this kind of stuff. How on earth can you guys claim to be discriminated against minorities? But evangelicals view it differently, right? Because the word Christian means something different to an evangelical than what it means to the broader population. So when seculars talk about, what are you guys talking about? Like, this is a quote-unquote Christian nation. Yeah, it's a Christian nation in the sense of, or has been, used to be, a Christian nation in the sense of this sort of like vanilla, mainline, civil religion, again, sort of like as represented by maybe the Episcopal Church, right? Evangelicals don't actually think those people are Christians, right? They don't actually view those people as Christians. And so when they use the word Christian, they're specifically talking about themselves. They're specifically talking about born-again, biblical, authoritative Christians, and they have always been a minority in American public life. And you think back to Jimmy Carter's election in 1976, the mainstream press, to a very significant extent, treated him like he was something foreign, right? They clearly did not understand this whole like born-again Christian thing. And he was mocked then, right? And that particular brand of Christianity, which to this group is the only kind that's legitimate, right, is made fun of in the popular culture, right? It is the thing that you're allowed to make fun of. And so when they see somebody who's willing to fight back for them, they're willing to jump on board.
I wanted to add to the fighter comment, to your question about why get behind the fighter particularly, and then also kind of hook into Joanna's comments on political correctness. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what is political correctness. Like, what does that even mean when you say, someone's willing to tell it like it is, and political correctness is it's a very important problem in America, like 71% of people agree with that. I think that it has a couple of different facets to what that means. One that we found in Cato polling is that 58% of Americans feel like they have political views that they can't share. And that includes liberals and conservatives and moderates. Everyone feels like they have some views that they can't share, which makes it hard to actually have a dialogue, right? If there's certain facts you can never talk about. But I think there's something, I wanted to look at like a specific facet of political correctness. So I think that an example that I would look at is immigration. Immigration, and I work at the Cato Institute, so we spend a lot of time talking about the benefits, the many, many benefits of immigration, and there are many. But there are some costs too, right? Yeah. Change is hard. Change is hard. And I think that elite circles, for fear of aggravating social tensions, have downplayed allowing any discussion about costs of immigration, as just an example. There's many, many different topics we could talk about, but if we're just using an example of immigration, and have really elevated and emphasized the benefits. And I completely get that, because if you talk about the cost, there's fears that people would overemphasize those costs, and that would exacerbate social tensions. But I think that left an opportunity. You don't change people's minds by making it socially unacceptable to ever talk about the costs of something that's frustrating them. What you do, actually, if you look at the research from social psychologists like Jonathan Haidt, the only way you change people's minds is by creating circumstances in which ideas can be challenged. People have their gut reactions first. Then when someone challenges them and says, why is that your view? They have to come up with reasons. That's the only real time that people change their minds. So by not talking about the costs, it created, I think, an environment where you had a lot of feelings festering. Donald Trump comes along and he blows the top off of it, in perhaps not the most sophisticated way one could imagine talking about costs or frustrations with immigration. Imagine, I don't know exactly what this would look like, but conversations that tried to, in a more maybe compassionate way, talk about costs and benefits of immigration and deal with those in a more realistic way, I think leaves less space for that kind of figure to come in and blow the top off. So to your point about the fighter, I think people get frustrated when there are things that are happening that are not socially acceptable to talk about, and that even if they're not the most important things, it's frustrating that they can't talk about them. And then there's this guy that comes along and says, I'm going to talk about them, and I'm going to talk about them in the least politically correct way possible, just to make the other guys mad.
Trolling is a big.
I think that has a lot of appeal to the people who feel frustrated. They feel like that person is a fighter for their side. And I think, I'm not saying that this is just about immigration, but that's just an example of what I think people mean by political correctness and what they think about Donald Trump's role in being the fighter and blowing the top off a lot of these issues.
Okay. Well, I don't think I'm going to get to the rest of these 9 questions, but maybe one more. And I really, I'm glad you brought up, Emily, the issue of immigration, because that's something I actually wanted to talk about as well. We've seen, I think, among conservative Christians, a sort of deprioritization of sexual morality issues in the last couple of years. And one question is whether this is a maybe short-term tactical shift, or are we seeing a more permanent recalibration, given sort of the cultural changes we're seeing on things like same-sex marriage, premarital sex, where young people are just in a very different place than older Americans. We've seen these really stark generational shifts. So is that era of the 90s over? So anyone want to dive in?
I went first last time.
I'll take the bullet. So I think that we are in a time of significant anxiety culturally over rapid changes in the cultural, political, and legal norms around sexuality. And the political battles have taken a certain type of arc, although it's been a very quick arc, with Obergefell in 2015, which was the culmination of a long series of decisions from the Supreme Court and lower courts legalizing same-sex marriage, but also the current state of the discussion on, for example, creating federal non-discrimination rights for people who identify as lesbian, gay, transgender, or bisexual. And those debates really matter, in part because I think they are the tip of an iceberg of a deep well of cultural anxiety and sense of displacement around things that people believe are really fundamental. So I think on a side that's more progressive, people, especially in a more politically active community, believe that these issues are, first of all, uncontestable, that people should have these types of protections and rights, and also that this is one of the most fundamental justice issues of our time, that being able to protect people and have protected status based on your gender identity or sexual orientation is hugely important for protecting people's rights and is core to who they are. And then I think you have on a conservative side a sense of real anxiety around very quickly changing frameworks and norms around how we talk about gender, around the accepted public opinion on what is okay for human sexuality, on especially the types of legal principles that are being put into place that conservatives perceive could potentially lead to discrimination. You see this all the time right now with fights with Catholic adoption agencies, or colleges, evangelical colleges, all of these institutions that believe that one day there might be a federal legal regime that requires them in their hiring, in their firing, in the way that they place certain types of business deals to not have any type of viewpoint stated around human sexuality or gender identity, which they see as core to their belief. So all of that means that we're in a time of huge ferment. And I do think that we've been in a really quick arc. It is kind of hard to remember what it was like before 2015, but the conversation was very, very different around these issues. It was not necessarily inevitable that same-sex marriage was going to become legal through a Supreme Court decision. And so I, as a reporter, just always try to remember the fact that we're in this age where news cycles seem like they're forever, but actually 2015, 4 years ago, is not that long ago, and that there's a lot of cultural adjustment that's happening at a rapid pace right now. And for me, what that means is these are spots to watch, and I do keep quite an eye on them in terms of understanding what people might be experiencing or feeling in relationship to the culture and government norms.
So I'll add to that a little bit. So when we think about issues of sexual morality, right, it is important to remember that the two, I guess, defining issues motivating the Christian right, certainly in the 90s and the 2000s, were abortion and gay rights, right, or opposition to certain advances in gay rights. And with one of those, abortion, well, we sometimes don't think about that as a quote-unquote sexual issue, and there are different aspects to that issue, right? But that is one of the aspects, right? So part of the debate over abortion, right, is whether or not this fetus is a person, right, and therefore has rights, and those rights should be protected, including like the right to life, right? That's one piece of the debate. Another piece of the debate is certainly has to do with women's rights, right, and sort of the degree to which the government has the right to sort of step in and tell women, right, what to do with respect to their reproduction. But a third element, right, again, if you look at survey data and look at the relationship between different types of attitudes and beliefs on abortion, you do see that people who have, controlling for a bunch of other stuff, people who have traditional views with respect to sexual morality and specifically are highly opposed to sex before marriage, right? That view is highly predictive of pro-life abortion attitudes, right? And as we've seen this evolution in the Christian right, I guess you would say, over the course, or in society over the course of the past 20 years, you see this tremendous change with respect to the gay rights side of the equation, but not on abortion, right? That hasn't moved at all. That has continued to be central. That occupies the center of evangelical political identity. And so in that respect, then, you could see some evidence for sexual morality politics still being highly relevant. Now, with respect to gay rights, I think a really good argument can be made that part of the change that we've seen there, I mean, in the society in general, but you do see these changes among Republicans as well, and even among evangelicals. It's that, as more and more people have come out, then more and more people have been confronted with this question of, okay, here's this person I've known forever. They seem like a decent person. I love this person. This person is my son or my daughter or my sister or my aunt or whoever, and now they've just told me that they're gay. So I now have a choice, right? Do I hold on to my beliefs with respect to this stuff, or do I decide to love my friend or my family member? And people have said that part of the reason why attitudes towards gay rights have changed so much more rapidly than attitudes towards, say, racial discrimination and racial civil rights and stuff is that, hey, like, gay people are embedded right in the center of everybody's lives, right? And everybody's families. And so people are confronted with these choices in ways that they're not with respect to differences across race or some other differences. So anyway.
I want to reframe the question, and Emily, and ask you directly, if, given you spend a lot of time on studying immigration and immigration attitudes, the Pew Research Center has found over the past few years that the priority of immigration has increased dramatically among the GOP, also among evangelical Christians as well. And are we seeing sort of a displacement where the immigration issue will overtake, say, the gay rights arguments as a sort of a cultural flashpoint? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that when it comes to like same-sex marriage, those kind of specific issues, I think immigration has overtaken that as a priority, in part because of the rhetoric from the top Republican political spokesperson right now, because that's been a feature of Trump's policymaking, or more his rhetoric, I should say, right? But I think, to Emma's point about the issues about kind of transgender bathrooms and gender identity, I could imagine that having a lasting role as well. And in particular, it's about the pace of change I'm thinking about. That a couple of years ago, I think most people thought there were only two genders. And then they've discovered that apparently there are many more, and they're worried they could get fired because they were unaware of this, right? That a couple of years ago, transgender identity was categorized as a mental disorder among psychologists, and then that's now changed. That pace of change, it's gone from being viewed this way to all of a sudden you could get fired from your job and lose friends because of having the wrong opinion. I think that scares people of a more kind of socially conservative persuasion, whereas others find that pace of change to be a good thing, right? So I could imagine those issues supplanting the old issues of kind of same-sex marriage. Abortion seems like it will continue for the reasons that you said, because attitudes haven't changed much.
Right.
But immigration, I think, will continue to be of importance. What I don't know, though, is if Donald Trump is not the spokesperson for the Republican Party, will that continue to be the most important issue? Because it wasn't before.
Right.
Right.
It wasn't before.
I mean, I have a thought.
David,
on
I
this.
have to cut you off.
Okay, fine.
If no one has any questions in the audience and we can continue talking, that may
It'll
not
probably
be the
come
case.
up again.
So we'll start with this gentleman right here. We have a mic for you.
Thank you. An observation and a comment. You mentioned how changes in attitudes toward gay and lesbian have progressed quite rapidly in the U.S. because people realize family members are gay, friends are gay. My observation is I wonder how much more quicker positions would change on the abortion issue if people knew that their friends, relative women also had abortions, because it's been noted that in the southern states, the rate of abortion among evangelical women is the same as the general population. That's an observation. In your questioning, doing surveys, or Emma, in your reporting, were questions ever asked of evangelicals, how do they comport their political positions with what they believe Jesus said or what Jesus communicated that's communicated in the New Testament? Those red letter words. How do they rationalize the two for their positions on Trump or immigration, the southern border situation, various other issues that are important to everyone?
So I can take on the last question. I think you see a real spread in attitudes on this question of, does Trump need to be a Bible representing president? So you see some people who are leaders in the evangelical movement who try to use Bible verses to justify things he has done and said. You saw this from former Attorney General Jeff Sessions. You see this from prominent pastors in Texas who are on Fox News all the time defending him, trying to say, yes, he is acting in accordance with the Bible. You see another school of thought that says, he's my president, not my Sunday school teacher, that there can be an appropriate distance between the policy decisions of our political leaders and the things that you're learning in Sunday school. And then I think there are some people who really are trying to navigate this in-between space, that they can understand that maybe sometimes Trump does not comport himself in a way that they think a good Christian, quote unquote, should comport themselves, but that he is defending certain beliefs that they have, that they believe some things he does and says are core to what they see as their religious teachings. I think abortion is a huge part of this. And I think the end of this question is that people are really complicated and they have all sorts of conflicting views. We are not creatures where consistency and straight rational checkability on all of our views is necessarily the foremost way that most people live their lives. And so I think that leads to a complicated space and a complicated set of conversations among evangelicals around this. But I don't know that sort of checking off every quote in the New Testament and seeing whether Trump has lived up to that line or not is the way that a lot of voters are thinking about their support for Trump.
How does that comport what scriptures teach, particularly, even something as basic as the golden rule, and then you get more deeper into how Jesus said we should treat each other and all the rest. How do they comport their views with what they say they believe when they go to church?
Well, not to sort of go debate team on that, but I do think it's notable that some of Trump's closest evangelical advisors actually stepped out against him on that particular issue. Yeah. So you saw Franklin Graham pushing back against Trump. Pastor Jensen Franklin, who's from Georgia, who's one of his big supporters, was making a statement against it. You see some spread from people, especially in those representative sort of pastor roles, who don't approve of some of those policies and do push back. But they would say, I as a Christian have to be here to advise my president specifically so that I can be here to tell him that we don't agree with putting children in these kinds of detention facilities. So I think it's really complicated.
Even Ted Cruz spoke out against that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, right here. Yeah, pink shirt.
Maybe first a real brief comment for David. You raised the issue of the doctrine question.
Yeah.
And, from working in philanthropy with seminaries and Christian colleges,
Yeah.
if there are maybe 85 million evangelicals today, a lot are wrestling, I think, with this idea that there's creation, fall, redemption, consummation.
Right.
And there are some traditions that only focus on fall
Right.
and redemption. And those would readily comport with the adjectives that you described. But those that are sort of recovering the creation piece would maybe say something a little closer to Reagan at the library. So that's just a thought.
Yeah.
And then the question for Emma and Emily, probably maybe more broadly, but the demographic question. So 35% of millennials and below are now nuns. They're formerly nuns. It's a much bigger percentage than others. And we went from
N-O-N-E.
That's right.
Not N-U-N.
And we went from 5% in 1972 to I think it's 23% today. I wonder if you might comment on the significance of that demographic for the relationship between religion and politics discussed today.
So I would say, in general, the story of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, is a decline in the power and influence of religious institutions, these structures of affiliation and affinity that have been organizing principles for people's lives, like, for example, church. And the decline in religiosity is not necessarily paired exactly with the decline in religious belief. We were actually just talking before this about the flourishing of different types of spiritual and religious-y beliefs in that segment of the population, especially among young people. And so what I think that means for our political story today is that those institutions have less power over people's viewpoints than they once did, less power to be the greatest organizer in politics, although they're still extremely influential and extremely powerful. And I think in general, it's a little bit of a free-for-all in terms of resetting some of these conceptions about what you do and don't do in politics, what cultural beliefs do and don't reign. So the story of the nuns for me is sort of a story of rescrambling institutional power and also a rescrambling of the rules of politics and how we're thinking about the next generation and what their political landscape is going to look like.
I'm so glad that you dealt with the kind of the institutional role because I've looked at it from a different angle, so it's nice to have both together. So it's not just young people. It's more so among young people. But if you look at the graph, right around 1992, 1993, the share of people who don't affiliate with any religious domination just starts to increase dramatically, quadrupled for all Americans, tripled for conservatives. So it's not like it just affected one political group and not another. And there have been a couple of hypotheses about what the impact of this is, but research that I've done looking at religious Trump voters based on how often they attend religious services finds pretty strong correlations, statistically significant correlations, even if you control for education and other potential factors, that religious conservatives that attend church more frequently have more favorable attitudes than secular conservatives towards African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Muslims, Jewish people. They have perhaps more moderate attitudes when it comes to immigration. They volunteer more, and they have much higher levels of social trust and social capital. They feel more satisfied with the relationships in their community, their personal relationships in their own life. So there are a lot of pretty strong correlations there with church attendance among just conservatives. And when some people looked at that, they said, wait, they're more liberal. And on some issues, that's true, not on all of them, right? But what I think that religious institutions have the capability of doing, and it's not unique to just one institution, I actually found these relationships for members of other religious denominations besides Christians. It's Christians, Muslims, like all the different groups we looked at, basically. That religious institutions can have a moderating influence and can kind of bring people together. I actually saw this, there were some correlations too for Hillary Clinton voters, that they became more conservative on certain issues as well. Not immigration, but on other issues. And so religious institutions can have the capacity to bring people a little bit closer together on their political views. They have something in common that they can talk about. And I think a lot of people that were involved in the LGBT culture wars were really hopeful that by encouraging people to disengage from religion, that people would become more liberal on LGBT issues. And that certainly is true. That does seem to be the case. But the direction goes the other way on all these other issues of race, immigration, and identity.
Sorry, Joanne.
30 seconds?
Yeah,
Is that okay?
30 seconds.
The other thing to keep in mind is that the reason that we write so much about white evangelicals and the reason why so much ink has been spilled about them is they take up a disproportionate amount of the electorate. They're only about, depending on who you ask, 15 to 16% of the population is white evangelical Protestant, but 26% of the electorate is white evangelicals. If you look at it the opposite way, your question about the religiously unaffiliated, they take about a quarter of the population, and Dan's going to fact check me on this because I'm citing his analysis. It's going to be 16 to 17% of the electorate. So they're more unaffiliated, but they don't show up at the polls. And that's essentially like favorability, attitudes on policy, all very interesting, but like what does it actually come down to? Who's going to vote? Who's going to show up?
There's a young woman down here.
I got a mic for you. Thank you for taking my question.
Sure.
I think it was kind of answered just now, but I was wondering at the beginning of the presentation about the survey process, and I noticed that within the data there were groups that were specified as white, and I was just wondering if whether or not within the sample there were people of color considered or asked any of these questions.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
The reason that I focused on white evangelical Protestants, white Catholics, and white mainlines in my analysis is because we're talking a little bit more about the religious right. I think there were enough black Protestants to break out. I decided not to include them. I think they actually might be in the article that's going up today at Morning Council that uses this data. I don't think we had enough Hispanic Catholics to make any statistical claims about that group, but they're definitely in there. We focused on them because of just the topic of the talk. But the crosstabs will be online. I encourage you to take a look, explore. Don't make any assumptions about any group where it's like under 200, 150 people.
I'm told I'm allowed one more question.
She's really been.
Young woman, yep.
My name is Barbara Dello, and I came to this talk because I believe America is losing its principles, patriotism, and religious values to some degree, and I think you guys kind of reinforced that. The numbers are staggering and the churches are empty, in my faith. Yet, today, in the education system, predominantly has a secular and liberalizing effect. And more of the time children spend is in the education system and is in daycare. And if it's government daycare or government education, you know, they're really very hands-off with religion. Or, you know, it's like multi-religion, which kind of is defeating for your personal religion. Can we reclaim the values and principles of our populace without addressing the anti-religious and uber-liberal bias in the public school system? And I also agree with you, among Catholics, you guys have a lot of work to do.
So I'm not going to touch the liberal bias in education part, but I will sort of say a couple of things about the decline in religiosity and institutionalized religion and some of the consequences of that. So to quote Ross Douthat, who's a conservative Christian columnist for the New York Times, and summarizing Emily's work, he says, right, if, hey, liberals and even Chamber of Commerce or libertarian-type Republicans, if you thought that you didn't like the religious right, you're really not going to like the post-religious right, right? And what he's referring to there is this fact that even within the Republican Party, right, we have seen this secularization over time. While conservative Christians overwhelmingly support Trump, they are a declining share of the Republican Party relative to what they were in the 2000s or the 1990s. And so a byproduct of that, right, is a shift in the type of issues that are emphasized. And so, you know, there is a lot, you know, the main cleavage in American politics today does seem to be this immigration issue, and it wasn't before. And in fact, the Republican Party really did not want it to be the defining cleavage, right, following 2012. Voters in 2016, Republican voters, certain type of Republican voters, forced it to be. And who were they? They weren't the Christians, right? They weren't the religious right, right? They were the secular or maybe I call myself a Christian, but I never attend church, folks. And so the argument is that, hey, the secularization is opening the door within republicanism or conservatism for something darker, right? More broadly, your point about the decline in religious institutions more generally, a lot has been written. Well, that's what I'm going to talk about, right? And so, because I feel like I'm patting you on the back, is to say that this has indeed produced an alienation. Tim Carney has a great new book. He did a talk on it here. That the decline in civic culture, right, which religious institutions and religiosity and Christian values and whatnot, however you want to frame that, support is leading to this. To all kinds of negative consequences in American society. Are we going to get those back? I would say no.
So we are actually at time, but I would encourage you to come talk to our panelists after the sessions. And if you join me in giving a round of applause for